There's something about you that most people can't quite name, something that makes you different from the generations before you, and quietly, profoundly different from the ones that came after. It's not nostalgia, it's not stubbornness, and it's definitely not that you don't get technology, or that you peaked somewhere between a cassette tape and a VHS rental store. It's something deeper than that, something that was forged in a specific window of time, a window that may have looked ordinary from the outside, but was, psychologically speaking, one of the most formative environments a human being could grow up in. If you were born between 1965 and 1980, you already know what it feels like to be the forgotten generation. You came after the boomers, who got the cultural reverence. You came before the millennials, who got the generational analysis. And for a long time, you just existed, quietly, getting things done, not waiting to be noticed. And here's what's interesting about that. Because the world wasn't watching you, you learned to watch yourself. Think about what it actually meant to grow up in that era. Latchkey kids, parents who worked, afternoons that belonged entirely to you, no one tracking where you were, what you were feeling, whether you needed validation or reassurance. You had to figure it out. You had to develop an internal compass when no external one was offered. That's not damage, that's architecture. Carl Rogers spent his career studying what it takes for a human being to become fully themselves, to stop performing, stop shrinking, stop waiting for permission. And one of the things he kept coming back to was this: the people who develop the deepest sense of self are often the ones who had to develop it alone, not abandoned, not neglected in the clinical sense, but left, given space, to construct meaning on their own terms. Gen X was given that space whether it asked for it or not, and something happened inside that space that most people still haven't fully understood. The first thing that happened, the thing that became the foundation of everything else, was that you learned to be your own source, not in the way self-help books talk about self-sufficiency, not the performative independence that people wear like a badge, but something quieter and more structural than that. You learned, from a very early age, that waiting for someone to tell you what to do, what to feel, or who to be was simply not an option that the world was offering you. So you stopped waiting. You built an internal life that didn't require an audience. You processed your own confusion. You talked yourself through your own fear. You developed an inner dialogue, sometimes messy, sometimes surprisingly clear, that became more reliable to you than almost any external voice you encountered. And that internal self-sufficiency, that capacity to be genuinely okay inside your own company, to return to yourself without anxiety, that isn't something most people are born with. It's something you were quietly, involuntarily trained to develop, and it became the bedrock on which everything else was built. But self-sufficiency alone doesn't explain what Gen X actually became, because alongside that internal independence, something else was developing. Something more precise, a trust in your own perception that ran deeper than confidence, deeper even than certainty. If you've ever sat in a room where everyone was nodding along to something that didn't feel right to you, and instead of nodding, you simply went quiet, filed the observation away, and waited, you already know what this is. It's not contrarianism, it's not ego, it's a finely calibrated trust in your own judgment that developed because, for much of your early life, your judgment was the only instrument available. There was no helicopter parent cross-checking your read on a situation, no therapist helping you decode the subtext. Just you, your instincts, and the slow accumulation of experience teaching you when to trust what you felt. That trust became something Gen X carries differently from other generations, not as arrogance, but as a quiet, settled authority over your own perception of reality. And that's rarer than the world acknowledges. If this is already resonating, if you're recognizing something in yourself that rarely gets named this clearly, this channel exists exactly for that kind of recognition. Subscribe if you haven't yet. Leave a like if this is speaking to something real. And stay with me, because we're only just beginning to go beneath the surface. Now, think about the world you were handed, not the romanticized version, not the neon and the mixtapes and the John Hughes films. The actual world, the Cold War humming underneath everything, AIDS rewriting the rules of intimacy and mortality in real time, factories closing, parents quietly renegotiating what a stable life even meant, the slow, uncomfortable collapse of the post-war promise that if you followed the script would protect you. You were never given a script that actually held. And what do you do when the map doesn't match the territory? When the structures you were supposed to rely on keep shifting underneath you? You stop depending on the structures, and you start developing something internal that doesn't need external stability in order to function. That's what adaptability looks like at its deepest level. Not flexibility as a personality trait, but a structural rewiring, a psychological architecture built on the understanding that the ground will move, that the rules will change, and that the only truly reliable constant is your own capacity to reassess, recalibrate, and keep moving. Gen X adapted before adapting was even a concept people discussed. You didn't call it resilience. You didn't post about it. You just did it, and then you did it again. But here's the part that goes even deeper than adaptability. Because learning to adapt to a changing world is one thing. Learning to stay functional inside a world where the outcome is genuinely unknown, where there is no resolution coming, no clarity on the horizon, no clean ending to wait for. That's something else entirely. That's the capacity psychologists call tolerance for ambiguity. And it is, in many ways, the rarest psychological gift that Gen X developed without knowing it was a gift at all. Most people need resolution. They need the story to end, the verdict to come in, the email to be answered. The absence of certainty produces a kind of low-grade anxiety that can quietly run an entire life, driving decisions that aren't really decisions so much as escapes from the discomfort of not knowing. Gen X, by and large, doesn't operate that way. You learned, because you had to, that not knowing is a livable condition, that you can work, love, create, and commit while the larger questions remain open. That uncertainty is not an emergency. It's just the actual texture of being alive. That capacity to hold open questions without being destabilized by them is something the modern world is desperately trying to teach people and largely failing. And you developed it naturally, structurally, because the alternative was paralysis and no one was offering you the luxury of paralysis. There's another layer here that doesn't get talked about enough. Alongside all of that internal architecture, the self-sufficiency, the judgment, the adaptability, the tolerance for ambiguity, Gen X develops something that operates almost like a sixth sense, a radar for what is real. You came of age before curated identity was a concept, before personal brands, before the version of yourself you performed online started bleeding into the version you actually believed in. Your sense of self was formed in analog rooms, with analog friction, with real consequences for pretending to be someone you weren't, and that formation left a mark. You can feel inauthenticity before you can name it. You can sense the gap between what someone is saying and what they actually mean. You can walk into a room, hear the official narrative, and know, before anyone has given you a single piece of evidence, that something doesn't quite add up. That's not cynicism. That's perceptual accuracy. It's a radar that was built through years of having to read situations without guidance, having to distinguish what was real from what was performed, having to trust your felt sense of a room over the accepted version of events. And that radar is a strength of extraordinary value, especially now, because what naturally accompanies that radar, what grew alongside it, quietly, over decades, is a particular quality of mind that Gen X carries differently from almost every other generation, a critical intelligence that refuses easy answers, not cynicism, not nihilism, not the detachment that people sometimes mistake it for, but a genuine, principled resistance to being sold a simple story about a complex world. Gen X watched institutions fail, watched authority figures reveal themselves as human, flawed, sometimes corrupt, watched the cultural narratives that were supposed to hold everything together quietly unravel, not dramatically, not all at once, but slowly enough that you could see the seams coming apart while the people around you were still pretending the fabric was fine. And you didn't perform outrage about it. You didn't build an ideology around the disillusionment. You just stopped trusting the official version quietly, internally, as a form of intellectual hygiene rather than rebellion. That skepticism, that capacity to look at what the room is agreeing to and ask, privately, whether it's actually true, is a form of critical intelligence that is increasingly rare and increasingly necessary. It's what makes Gen X extraordinarily difficult to manipulate, extraordinarily resistant to groupthink, extraordinarily capable of holding an independent perspective in environments designed to produce conformity. That's not a flaw in your character. That's one of your most sophisticated psychological features. And yet, and here's where it gets more tender, all of that sophistication, all of that internal architecture, all of that quiet competence and perceptual accuracy and capacity to function alone and think independently, none of it made you invulnerable. It just made your vulnerability very private, because somewhere underneath the adaptability and the judgment and the radar and the skepticism, there is a person who carried a great deal without being asked if the weight was manageable. A person who became the reliable one, the capable one, the one who handles it so consistently and so early that it stopped being a role and started feeling like an identity. Responsibility wasn't something you stepped into gradually. It was something that settled onto you quietly and never fully left. And that's where the deepest strength of Gen X lives. And also where its most unexamined cost lives too. There's a specific kind of grief that accompanies a childhood that asked too much of you too soon. Not dramatic grief. Not the kind that demands to be witnessed. A quiet grief for the softness that didn't get to last as long as it should have. For the moments when you needed someone to sit with you, and instead you learned to sit with yourself. For the times you realized that being mature for your age was less a compliment and more a necessity. You made peace with those moments privately. You integrated them without ceremony. You moved forward because moving forward was what was available. And in doing so, you developed an internal steadiness that does not depend on applause, reassurance, or even understanding from others. You learned how to metabolize disappointment without turning it into bitterness. You learned how to carry complexity without demanding that it simplify itself for your comfort. And that quiet, unannounced integration of hard things, that capacity to absorb difficulty without collapsing, to feel the full weight of something and keep going anyway, that is the final, and perhaps the most profound strength that Gen X built. Not the loud resilience of the comeback story, not the resilience that gets posted about and celebrated, but the kind that happens at 2 a.m., alone, when no one is watching, and you decide, without drama, without announcement, that you are going to be okay. The kind that doesn't broadcast itself because it was never built for performance. It was built for survival. And then, slowly, it became something more than survival. That kind of resilience doesn't ask for recognition. It never has. But it deserves to be named. There's a concept Rogers called unconditional positive regard. The experience of being seen and accepted exactly as you are. Without conditions. Without performance. Without needing to earn it. And one of his core beliefs was that when people were deprived of that early, they built elaborate internal structures to compensate. Structures that were brilliant, functional, even beautiful in their complexity, but structures that also carried a cost. Gen 10 built those structures, and many of you have been living inside them for so long that the structure has started to feel like the self. But it isn't. The structure is what you built to survive. The self is what was always underneath it. And what's underneath, when you get quiet enough to feel it, is someone who is curious and attentive and capable of a tenderness so precise it almost frightens you. Someone who notices small shifts in tone. Someone who reads between lines effortlessly. Someone who still carries a surprising capacity for wonder, even after decades of recalibrating to reality. Someone who feels things more deeply than they usually let on. Someone who has spent decades watching the world with a clear-eyed care that they learned to disguise as detachment. Because at some point, openness felt like exposure. Because showing too much softness once felt unsafe. Because vulnerability, in the environments that shaped you, was rarely mirrored back with steadiness. But you're older now, and the armor that served you so well, that beautiful, hard-won armor, maybe quietly asking to be set down, not abandoned, just rested, not because it was a mistake, but because it was successful. It did what it needed to do. It carried you through instability, through uncertainty, through cultural shifts that would have destabilized many others. And now, perhaps, you are strong enough to see that the armor is optional, so you can finally feel the difference between the person you built yourself to be and the person you actually are. The difference between competence and connection, between functioning and being known, between enduring and allowing. That's not a crisis. That's an arrival. And the remarkable thing, the genuinely remarkable thing, is that even through all of it, even through the self-reliance and the unwitnessed adaptations, and the quiet exhaustion of being the generation that everyone assumed was fine, because you always seemed fine, you kept going. Not because someone told you that you were special, not because a cultural mythology was built around your struggle, but because something inside you, something that developed precisely in those silent, unsupervised afternoons, in those rooms where no one was watching, refused to stop. That refusal, that quiet, persistent, unspectacular decision to keep becoming, even without an audience, even without a roadmap, even without anyone asking how you were doing with all of it, that may be the most underrated psychological feature of your entire generation. Not grit as a brand, not resilience as a content strategy, but the raw, lived, biological level decision to remain in motion, to stay in the process of becoming yourself, even when the direction wasn't clear and no one was tracking your progress, to continue refining your inner compass even when the external landmarks kept disappearing. That is what Gen X is made of, not the irony, not the flannel, not the latchkey kid shorthand that reduces a generation to an aesthetic, but this, people who learn to become themselves largely in private, who built identity without a blueprint, who developed 7 distinct and profound psychological strengths, not as a curriculum, not as a program, but as the natural consequence of being asked to grow up in a world that didn't slow down to make sure they were okay. And now, in a cultural moment saturated with noise and performance, and the algorithmic pressure to be seen and validated and legible to an audience at all times, that capacity for inner orientation isn't a relic, it's exactly what the world needs. If you've stayed with this until now, if something in this felt less like information and more like recognition, then you already know this is a space worth returning to. Subscribe to this channel. Leave a like if this moved something in you. And please, leave a comment below. Tell me which of these strengths you recognize most in yourself. Tell me what part of growing up Gen X you feel the world has never quite understood. Your words won't disappear into the void here. They'll be read. They matter. Because that's the final thing worth saying. All of these strengths, the self-sufficiency, the judgment, the adaptability, the tolerance for ambiguity, the radar for what's real, the critical mind, the silent resilience, they were built in private, developed without an audience, carried without acknowledgement, but you were never meant to carry them alone forever. You are allowed to be witnessed now, not to be fixed, not to be analyzed, but to be seen, clearly, accurately, without the performance, for exactly who you became in all those years when no one was looking. You were built differently, and it's time the world finally understood what that actually means.